Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Will Hutson, and welcome to the MIT Enterprise Forum Boardroom Webinar Series. This is the season finale. And our topic today is going to be, is the COVID-19 outbreak a black swan or the new normal? If anybody has any questions, we will have the Q&A to the bottom right-hand corner of your browser live. We'll be checking that if there's time at the end. But without further ado, I want to introduce our speaker, Dr. Steve Griffiths. He's the Senior Vice President, Research and Development, Professor of Practice at Khalifa University and of Science and Technology. And with that, I'll let Dr. Steve introduce yourself.
Thanks very much, Will, and thanks to Enterprise Forum for inviting me to the session today. Certainly a very interesting topic and one that we're living real time, so it's a pleasure to be here. As Will said, I'm Steve Griffiths. I'm Senior Vice President, Research and Development at Khalifa University in Abu Dhabi, which is in the UAE. At Khalifa University, I oversee all the R&D activity, which includes administrative activities, the types of things we do, tech transfer and sponsored research and laboratories and computing and such. But more importantly, there's a strategic side of this. And so the things we do around research centers and research institutes is where I spend a lot of my time thinking about the challenges that we face at the university and in Abu Dhabi and globally. So we cover areas that are very broad, and they're going to be relevant to the conversation today. Quite a bit with energy, so renewables and oil and gas sector, healthcare. We've been doing it, now it's only getting more important. We do a lot on digitalization in this form of supply chain logistics, and also space, being aeronautics and astronautics. In the digital area, we have the entire span of AI, robotics, data science, and ICT, and advanced materials in manufacturing. And so we've packaged these areas up in the 19 research centers and 3 institutes, and all of them now they're fairly well engaged in thinking about what they've been doing, but also the challenges with COVID-19.
Great. Well, Steve, they're lucky to have you at Khalifa. That sounds like a pretty impressive lineup you guys have going on there. And we're lucky to have you today. So without further ado, let's kind of kick off. So there are some themes that have kind of been relevant over the last 5, 10, 15 years that I think have taken a huge step forward with COVID-19. And, kind of top of mind, fourth industrial revolution, to your point about healthcare, the aging population, and even just, large scale environmental change and environmental impact. What are you seeing happening today in the market, in research and advancement, now that COVID-19 has kind of hit us in those areas? Are things speeding up? Are they taking newfound meaning? Are more stakeholders engaged? Where are you seeing things kind of come together?
Well, you ask a good question. And so I think, with all businesses, what you typically will be looking at, and what we do even with the research at KU, you try and see what the mega trends are, what's happening globally, what's happening in society, and then you build your long-term agenda around those themes, and then you come back, of course, to any of these immediate challenges and address those dynamically. So with the long term, you mentioned a few of these themes, and the climate change, of course, is one I think we're going to talk about quite a bit. Climate had really been getting a lot of traction before COVID, and I hope it still continues to be a global conversation. In 2015, with the Paris Agreement, where there was a very good recognition that we need to try to limit greenhouse gas emissions to the extent that global warming doesn't exceed 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius relative to pre-industrial levels. I mean, that was a strong agreement. We saw a lot of goodwill around that, but we're really not making the progress needed to achieve those targets. And people talk about the carbon budget, the greenhouse gas budget, what have you. If you look at just carbon dioxide emissions, we still know that based on the amount of CO2 we're putting in the atmosphere annually, we're going to be past that 1.5 degree target, based on some uncertainties, of course, there in the science behind the calculation, within a decade or so. And then we're going to get past 2 degrees shortly thereafter. And then it becomes an interesting discussion about what happens globally when you have these tipping points in climate and environment. So that's one area that we continue to focus on. The second area I think is interesting is demographics. So you have this whole climate thrust happening, changes going on there. And then you've got aging population. You've got now, just recently, we're seeing people over 65 in larger numbers than those that are under 5. So you would definitely see the global population getting older. We see people moving, everyone's talking about urbanization. So We're no longer having people live in rural environments, they're going to cities, and so much more urbanization. And we're having urbanization happen in areas which are in Asia and Africa, right? So we've always been thinking Europe and the US and recently Asia, of course, but now you see a whole other continent, Africa, waking up, where you've got urbanization and aging population, which will eventually hit there as well, though they're younger, obviously, than places like Europe. A different demographic emerging, which is going to be shaping the way in which these factors that we're talking about today influence society, because society will have a different look to it. On top of that, you got the fourth industrial revolution, which everyone's talking about now, which is a whole new generation of technologies. The way I look at it is the fourth IR, the 4IR is really, we'll talk about ICT-based technology, but really I see it's materials, biological sciences, and ICT converging in new ways that we hadn't been able to leverage before. I think on the digital ICT side, where people are really interested and where there's a lot of talk, it's moving very quick. We used to talk about big data, and with mobile technology, the generation of data from individuals. Now you're looking at this artificial intelligence that underpins so many different technologies: robotics, drones, virtual reality, augmented reality, additive manufacturing, 3D printing, blockchain. People now even quantum computing. It's one of those little areas out there which we talk about as a curiosity, but eventually it's going to come along too with certain applications to be relevant to the digital space. So I think fourth industrial revolution in its own right, forget pandemics, forget all this other stuff, is going to change industries in its own. And that's something we're looking forward to in our trajectory. And finally, to make it more complicated, you think about, you have climate, you've got society changing, you've got new technologies, which you hopefully will all be going for good. And geopolitics is getting very interesting, right? So you've got, I'm an American citizen. I'll live in Abu Dhabi now for 10 years, but as an American citizen, U.S.-China trade issues. Just recently, the U.S. now putting its halts on visas for worker immigrants that are coming to the U.S. to be technology workers. So I think tension in geopolitics, regional tensions, global tensions, that's going to play out in its own right too, because we've got the rise, of course, of China now as a major power. India becoming soon the most populous country, and so and they're, of course, one of many countries trying to increase its global status, along with other regions of Asia and Africa, as you mentioned previously in the demographic discussion. So I think the geopolitical dimension is going to be quite an interesting underpinning to all these moves. So with that said, I mean, you've got this mix of different areas in which you need to put your focus and your attention, and then you come along with the COVID-19 and you get a global health pandemic, and that puts yet another set of challenges to the fore. And now you have a realignment of the way people think about doing their daily business, and how we're going to be able to leverage technologies and work in a society which is, we're not sure yet, but it will definitely be somewhat impacted in the long run by the most recent events.
It's interesting because it's like four-dimensional chess here. So, at any time, it's like, can you make a Rubik's Cube of chess pieces? It's pretty wild how everything kind of collides. But if we can just simplify it a little bit and kind of bring it into context, for me, on the entrepreneur side, on the marketer side, kind of social economic side, I'm always much more interested in aligning incentives. Like, that's where I think real change happens. I think if you look at, I live in Dubai, you're in Abu Dhabi, a lot of the UAE's growth has been aligning incentives and doing certain things to get direct investment and other aspects of people to invest here. If we're looking at some of these mega cities and we're looking at maybe not the emerging cutting edge tech like graphene and AI and everything else there, but if you're looking at these kind of mega cities that are being built and you're looking at what they're grappling with on a daily basis, and this isn't in the middle of continental Europe, this is East Africa, West Africa, to your point, in Southeast Asia, how do people and how do the economies need to align incentives so that the development can still happen, jobs can still be created, entrepreneurs can still take risk, but it's not entirely without cause, or there is no taxes, or there is no, pathway to education or what have you? What's kind of the framework that people should be looking at to say, this is how we're going to be able to overcome some of these big obstacles. And at the same time, when you look at that framework, how does something like COVID-19 and coronavirus make it worse, or maybe speed up the adoption? What does that kind of look like?
Well, okay, so I do study quite a bit about cities and the evolution of cities, and of course, technology underpins the way I think about it. When you think about urbanization, you think about the mega trends and where society is going. If you put it all together into one holistic view about what people care about and where you can line up incentives as government and industry and the general population, as individuals, yes, we care about climate, but if you look at the most important factors to people as they go into cities, healthcare is extraordinarily important. If you're not healthy and your quality of life is not good, you're really nothing much else matters. Education is extraordinarily important to people, because we need to have people that are able to be educated so they can succeed. So education is another key area. You look at the way in which people consider the security of their everyday lives. And so you want to be healthy, you want to be educated, you want to be secure, and have a good work environment where you get a work-life social balance and be basically happy. So that in climate and health and all these, it's critical toward bringing back this notion of what it is to be happy. And that's why when you look at the UAE, and people thought it was a little bit strange at one point that Dubai wanted to be the happiest city on the earth. Yep. It sounds a little catchy, but it encompasses lots of different ideas. And so when you take that as being where we're headed with urban environments and where the globe is going, right, you can step into thinking about how the long term and moving toward creating healthy, safe, cities, which are good environments for people to live and work and undertake social activity. When you then have a disruption, which causes, in this case, the pandemic, you start to really see where there are urgent matters to be addressed. And you get a sense of why the outlooks for how a stimulus, for instance, to recover from an economic setback needs to be directed in certain areas to certain entrepreneurial activities to stimulate the growth of small businesses in areas that are going to be important for what I just talked about. The bigger companies, align them properly with your objectives to make them successful going in a way that's going to make it for an environment which is good for the people. So I think alignment of incentives is trying to understand what makes people, what motivates people to be in a location, and then try and target the means by which you allow businesses to succeed to serve these people. And so, I think now is an interesting time to watch the pandemic unfold, because you see opportunities to take advantage of new trends in the way people think about things. But obviously, it's also a way to do better as global citizens and how we rebuild and what they call the new normal. Let's say it's the old normal that's just being shifted a bit in ways we're not exactly sure yet because it hasn't played out fully. But it's an opportunity to really do things in a way that's going to be setting us up for a successful future if we do this so-called recovery from the pandemic in a right way.
So let's unpack the new normal. And I like that we're still sitting here in a macro position, because I want to start from the viewpoint and the mindset of a decision maker. And so maybe a government entity or a regulator or a policymaker or an NGO, and you're influential in your country, in your city, in your town. And so on one hand, we have exactly what you talked about. We've got the desire for better healthcare. Obviously, this has been exacerbated by it. The desire for upward mobility, better jobs, better education. And on the other hand, we've got everything we were just discussing. The carbon budget, and how we're going to miss that target. We've got the shifting demographics and an aging population. We've got a trend of megacities that we can't kind of put the genie back in the bottle now, because people are having large families in these megacities. So if we weigh those two up, and regardless if they're in a big city or not, what is kind of your message or thought process to those decision makers? And what would you tell them are the opportunities in the next quick wins, next 6 to 12 months? Here's where you can invest immediately, and it's going to serve you really well immediately, quick wins, but also 5 years, 10 years down the line.
Well, so think about what we've learned from the pandemic. I mean, because when you take the lessons learned and you apply that usefully to an economic stimulus of any kind, you're going to get outcomes which are which are at least reasonable, right? So I think if you take the things I've thought of as I've looked at the entire pandemic unfold and try to see where you'll get at least some level of persistence to what's now shaping up the global society, you're definitely going to have an increased focus on health. You know, whether or not we were sort of unconsciously thinking about health in the background and, you know, taking it on a daily basis as it is, or we were really focused on before, I think everyone now realizes that the importance of health. And that, to me, I was studying cities, knowing where smart cities go. To be a smart city, health has always been an underlying factor, but now that's going to be even more at the fore. And so I'm not certain that we'll always be so worried about infection and the spread of disease, but there will be a very, and maybe we'll talk about this later, there will be an awareness that, you know, this, whether or not you want to call COVID a black swan or not, there are health issues out there, which it could be a virus, it could be other things, you know, it can disrupt society in significant ways. So daily health and also these kind of challenges that arise, which with things like climate change and such coming forward, we could get into details about this. You know, there is probably at least some growing likelihood that further such events will happen in the future. And so health is going to be important. When you have health or any other, you know, whether it be geopolitical or be technology based, whenever there is some disruption which is significant and you're trying to think about how to prepare for the future, you need to look at resilience and flexibility. And so I know even in university, you know, when I first heard of the coronavirus in China, and we were told that there was going to be a preparation for business continuity, it was like, why? You know, what is this all about? Does this really matter? But then you start to put it together, and then something happens like we have now, and you realize business continuity, being ready to absorb a shock, is extremely important. And I don't know how in recent memory, at least in Western civilization, how often we've had such shocks to make the ability to be resilient, financially resilient, supply chain resilient to serve your customer. That is extraordinarily important. When you start to consider that you need to make the environment amenable to being resilient, then you also have to consider, can you be flexible? Because I mentioned the first thing I said was you want to be looking at megatrends, but then from year to year within a megatrend environment, you're going to have things that change the way you view the way you do business. And so you need to be flexible. You need to be able to adapt. So flexibility, whether it's going to be one of these ride-hailing companies starting to deliver groceries rather than people, or transferring your 3D printing or additive manufacturing technology to a new purpose, that is something that companies will be trying to incorporate as well. And then underlying all of that, you're going to have increasingly, at least from my view, you're going to have more government involvement, which gets back to the fact that there is now more than $10 trillion of stimulus going out there. Right now it's been rescued, but it was stimulus. So when you start to pump this money in, I think what you ultimately want to do is, I like to think about this notion of, I don't like to say destruction. You create a destruction. There is a time now in front of us where there has been a landscape change, and there are niches that have evolved, I think, in startup companies, in innovative big companies, and the landscape is right or the current regimes in which we operate in the cities, they're ripe for not necessarily disruption, but change. And so when you think about the startup ecosystem, it's worth $3 trillion globally, and it's a large number of people that are employed or in startup or new companies. I think you need to target these businesses which are going to be able to serve well these paradigms which are happening. So you see people, they're becoming more focused on health. The healthcare system, the regulation, I think, is going to change to be able to put effort toward improving continually, digitizing health records, promoting the health system, making the health system better. When you look at the business resiliency, when I talk about resiliency, companies, which can be platform providers, they can be the company themselves, but going digital, having automation, having robotic systems, having intelligent supply chains. These are all areas that startups can serve, big businesses can serve. And if you do well with how you deploy a stimulation to the economy, you'll get a lot of companies that are able to support this or able to incorporate this in their operations going better. Because digitalization is without a doubt, when you look at every stream I talked about, that's in there. Moving toward everything I mentioned with digital side of 4IR is in there. And then, to trying to create, again, flexibility. So you have companies which may emerge that are doing new things. You know, maybe their business has shifted, helping them get into a proper mode of operation through financial assistance is good.
Mm-hmm.
But as a government, you need to put some condition there. You yourself as a government, you need to be aware of where you're headed. So if I'm going to provide to a startup company, which is a novel innovative company of stimulus, great. Let's have some risk capital out there to let that happen. For the big companies, I don't believe, as I said, creative destruction, I don't believe that you just, let's make sure the coal company, let's make sure the automaker and the airline are all solvent. I wouldn't mind seeing airlines, as we've seen in France, for instance, they get a bailout and there is some climate target attached to that. Yep. Automotive manufacturers should go to electric vehicles. I don't think coal mines or coal plants have much to be said for them unless they want to put carbon capture on them. But I think, you can make the big companies also adhere toward new levels of novelty, innovation, again, prepare themselves to be resilient and flexible through the ways in which you administer funding. So it's a interesting time, because if we do this right, we can stimulate new companies, we can support existing companies, and we can make the world better. Although we've had a crisis, we can make the world better in the long run. If we don't do it right, we support the status quo. And then when this stuff happens again, it's going to be like deja vu. You're going to wonder, why didn't we learn our lesson, right? I think that we need to start shifting in ways in which we can be successful for the future.
It's great points you've made. And for me, when you talk about creative destruction, the first thing that comes to mind are some of these so-called zombie companies, and they're to some degree in the US, but they're pretty big in Europe and in Asia, which are some of these kind of O-line manufacturers, multi-generational companies that are literally worth the amount of debt and bonds that they've taken. So they're in essence naturally insolvent, and they're living just to kind of not reinsert those workers in the workplace. And so, as you've seen in some of these stimulus packages, to your point, many workers have said, I'm going to opt not to go back into the workplace, especially in some of the states and some of the provinces and countries that it skews a little bit more liberal. They're saying my unemployment benefits are better than me going back part-time to work. So I'm going to sit out and I'll reevaluate. And I think you're going to get some of that creative destruction in the workforce there. You bring up digitalization, and it's interesting because on one hand, when we talk about continuity, digitalization and continuity are kind of like hand in glove, okay? But when you talk about vigilance and you talk about resilience and kind of having your supply chain set up the right way, a lot of people don't think about digitalization. But digitalization and blockchain, to your earlier point, are a huge part of what you can do with your supply chain and how you can quickly diversify your supply chain. We saw a lot of businesses were on the hook for being too China-centric. And all of a sudden, something that they would get on a rolling basis every 2 or 3 days is now taking every 2 or 3 weeks, and now every 2 or 3 months. So walk everybody through just a little bit about how you see digitalization. There's obvious, we're all talking on Zoom right now. There's obvious fits for digitalization in terms of work from home and things like that. So and everybody's heard that. It's been beat to death a little bit, although it's very relevant. Talk a little bit about some of your experience looking at supply chain, to your point about geopolitical risk, and what digitalization could look like in that environment.
Well, so I think if you start from the idea of where digitalization can go into business, and you think about the technologies which I was mentioning previously, you can understand the platform. So when I say digitalization now, I'm talking about, let's say data, IoT is out there. So you've got just this massive and pervasive amount of sensing that's going on. Sensing in the sense that you're able to get satellite data, to space. Yep. I mentioned we do that at Khalifa University. So much amount of data that's going to be coming increasingly from satellites. So much amount of data that's already coming from sensor applications. So much is just collected from the infrastructure that we have already is providing us information around cellular or mobile technologies. Almost everything now, as we know, is this notion that the growth in collected data is just become a platform. So it's there and it's happening. You take that and then you start applying the technologies around artificial intelligence, which is it's machine learning today. I mean, it's going to evolve, and there's various modes and types of machine learning, but it's really a huge amount of data that goes through a statistical algorithm and then gives you some insights that are hard to uncover on the other side. Then you've got robotics, and you've got drones, and you've got the blockchain, and you've got additive manufacturing, VR, ARs. I'd say when you look at supply chain and you think about where things are going, a lot of companies today, they've become highly efficient, right? So that just-in-time manufacturing, you're able to know where your suppliers are. They're in a low-cost environment. Maybe it's in China, maybe it's somewhere in Southeast Asia. You get, very rapidly. We have international. Part of the problem with COVID is, we have a lot of globalization, so you can get places and get goods pretty quick, which doesn't help when you're trying to avoid the spread of the disease. But nonetheless, you can get things fairly quickly, and you can get things on demand from a set of suppliers. Now, insight into your supply network and knowing where you have diversity, which is sufficient to overcome different potential outcomes of disruption, right? If you take different scenarios analyses to the future and you want to figure out how to invest the right amount of money to be resilient such that, okay, maybe the outlier is not likely to happen case where you have, a down, China supply is down or Asia supply is down. How does that particular component, or how does that particular part, or whatever it may be, how does that flow through a network of, say, let's look at a Walmart, 100,000 suppliers, for instance.
Yep.
How does that network fit together? What is the impact of one region having it could be a health disruption, it could be a technological disruption, it could be a geopolitical disruption. How does that propagate through your supply chain, all your different tiers? Getting that level of insight is extraordinarily difficult. So with the modern computing technology, if you look at the ability to apply, say, for instance, the insights you get from a machine learning environment and how to do optimizations through that, through the different ways in which you can apply machine learning, you can start to figure out robust networks which are resilient as long as you have enough suppliers which are able to provide you what you need should you have a disruption in your main channel.
That's interesting.
The second part of that is, I would say, not just can you figure out where it should go, but you can also now do the tracking and ensure that when you have sensors in the goods, or at least the ability to sense where the goods are. I mean, getting insights on where shipments are happening from satellite data, whatever, and you can start to track that through the network and start to get some intelligence around the execution of the agreements, the contracts to say, it's a blockchain, for instance, take out all the intermediation of how transaction happens across the supply chain, start to have that automated, so the different points where you're supposed to have a check-in, say, of a good along the way. If that transaction is digitally recorded in an invariable way, which is secure, all the way till you have the supplier and the customer end their transaction, and that is a stable record, which almost required no human interaction. That's another huge win for supply chain optimization, which increases your resilience to your operation. So I think if you start to take the IoT notion of the digitalization, if you start to take the AI components of that, if you take paperless transaction, secure transaction through blockchain, you can apply digital to a whole host of different opportunities with business. And then in the business itself, I mean, I'd say the operation on the floor, you get into the how do you have robotics, for instance, able to take the worker off the floor so that you're more resilient. If you don't have a worker that can be infected and you have a robot doing the work, it's obviously you're going to have a better chance of continuing your business during the course of a disruption. So I think in the business side, digital is extremely important. On the consumer side, it's really interesting. Of course, what we're doing now is interesting. But I think the entire supply chain view is one that's also offers a lot of opportunity.
As you walk through it, to me, it just starts to kind of unpack each layer. And you've got, the transactional point, basically where the manufacturer goes to a distributor. And then obviously you've got the consumer point. But still on the more enterprise side, there's so many layers and so many opportunities to unpack, as you were saying, like IoT and how much data do they actually have, what we would call in marketing first party data. And that's kind of theirs. That's their oil. That's their secret sauce. And what they can do off the back of that is generally, from what I've seen in a lot of old school businesses, manufacturing, distributing businesses, totally untapped. And then to your point, what we would also call third-party data or outside data, coordinating that with satellite data or any other research, or a lot of governments are now opening up data sets in real time to try to spur on innovation around this. So where's the overlap between those data sets? And to the point of resilience, it makes me wonder, maybe some of the most commoditized businesses, like a distributorship, maybe these distributorships, their greatest value is their data. It's not actually the transaction point or the movement of goods, because that's been largely commoditized and they have raised within margins. But what if the data that they are gathering and that they are a witness to at every step of the supply chain is their actual, their most valuable products? That could be a really interesting thing, but you don't know that unless you've gone through digitization, unless you've really kind of taken your business from the ground up and said, okay, we're gonna be resilient. We're gonna put data and tech forward. That's super interesting. I want to kind of make a bit of a pivot to focus a little bit more off the back of that, but on things that folks in the audience that are starting businesses, running businesses might be more interested in. If you look at that trend on the existing enterprise side, but then overlap it with where startups are, what are the market opportunities? Is it around contactless, maybe on the consumer transaction side? Is it digital first, saying, I am going to build that distributorship model? Interesting idea, Will, but I'm going to do it digital first. No warehouses, no nothing, complete zero CapEx, all OpEx, and I'm just going to be that great pass-through, and I'm going to take a little piece off the top every time someone monetizes that data. Is it remote? Is it, hey, I'm just going to build a better mousetrap, a cheaper business, but I don't have the brick and mortar costs? We're remote first. What do those market opportunities look like from where you're sitting? Where are you seeing people kind of move capital, allocate investment, and drive research dollars towards?
Well, what's interesting is, there were long-term trends, which now with the COVID-19, you had a dynamic shock to the system. And so these long-term trends, which are, I think, going to result in a persistent reset or a persistent acceleration or catalyzation of what these different opportunities were going to be in a few years, they're now in front of us. Right. Maybe there's a few that are not, that really weren't as much in the scope, that are now opportunities as well. And I think from the idea of where we were headed and now what we can take advantage of immediately versus the future, I mean, certainly being able to move businesses online to the extent possible. If you were looking at any type of business that needed to have a presence or an ability to connect with people, in entertainment, or it can be in even health, people that are involved in workouts and their own personal health versus the gym, any type of area in which there was an opportunity to be able to move online and take advantage of increasing computing power, the ability of people to maybe do something in a more comfortable environment for them, maybe not, it's more comfortable. I mean, that's an opportunity which we'll have to see play out over time. But as a platform provider, if you're someone that can help move an organization to a situation where at least part of their business is able to be more robust to any kind of shock, that'll be, I think, something that is going to be adopted, right? Because organizations now, from at least the next few years, are going to realize that being able to be digitally flexible is going to be something that's going to be important for them. But then in the sense of manufacturing and such, we were already seeing the move toward robotics and automation. There was the concern about, will the workforce be replaced at some point in the future? I think all the more so now, seeing that there is going to be a demand for increased levels of automation. This will be a persistent shock. So today, I'd love if I were someone at a factory full of workers, they've been at home and I've been losing revenue. It'd be great if all of a sudden that entire factory line were automated. That will happen more quickly now, I think. I wouldn't say all the people will be replaced, but at least a substantial level of worker augmentation is going to happen. So that there'll be more jobs, which, the classic, we say dull, dirty, dangerous. The kind of jobs are readily replaced by a robotic system. I mean, that will happen. That should happen more quickly. So companies that know where the interventions can happen in manufacturing, I think would be well suited now to further engage in trying to make that shift happen quicker. So that's a very good opportunity. Whether or not, I'm not sure, as I mentioned, dynamic versus persistent, whether, people find it comfortable to stay away from the bricks and mortar, coffee shops and restaurants. They like home delivery and they found that convenient, or they just want to get back to their normal life as quickly as possible and do what they were doing. That's a little uncertain. I think there is an opportunity there. As I said, what will be persistent is the need to be able to move in these directions. Yeah. So at least some part of a business should be able to cater to these segments of people that may have found this is something they want to do for the long term. Maybe this will be, a greater share, more than 50% of the business in some cases, depending on how cultures absorb this current environment we're in and have that as a persistent norm for them. And I think that's an opportunity as well. I'd say for all startups, what needs to be done today, if you're looking at a very generalizable paradigm,
Sure.
when you say about how to be flexible, resilient, all these kind of things, you got to first look at all the areas in which you're currently having some kind of idea and think about what is the customer expectation now. I think there is an interesting opportunity to try and do like a market reassessment to some extent, to start to gauge where the best opportunity is to intervene in an area where there is been at least a need in the short run to move toward digital tools, as the theme we talked about, and all the different modes. Improve upon what's out there, because a lot of tools right now, as we found when we first started working from home, they're not as robust as we wanted, and they're improving every day.
Right.
But they're getting, where can you improve upon the things that now have just been put in front of us, right? I think if I were working in the sense of, if I were anyone engaged at all in virtual reality, I would be running pretty quick to see how I can improve the work from home meetings. I can't see your body language as well as I could if we were across each other from the table. That virtual reality, more so even than augmented reality. I think virtual, because augmented might probably more manufacturing, virtual, that's a great opportunity. I think that's their additive manufacturing. I mean, if you want to talk about supply chain resilient, if you're able to send a digital file to an organization, abroad, and they can just make something locally, that's a lot better than having to ship it, right?
Yep.
So I think, your ability to, and it's also quite flexible. I mean, additive manufacturing, you don't have tooled up production lines making one part, and all of a sudden you got to go from making a car to making a ventilator. No,
Sure.
You can do these things much more dynamically. So I think that tool, again, where in the business world can I cater to companies and provide them, an opportunity to have their business at least adopt these technologies and make them a bigger part of the business, or leverage them in ways they hadn't thought about. So I think, that exploring and discovering right now is a new opportunity. It's like a new world. What will be persistent? What will have just been dynamic and then fade out? It's uncertain. Now, if we knew the answer, we would all become very rich very quick, because we would just do all the same thing.
Later.
Yeah, so I think it's this exploration part, but that's what I said, creative destruction. I mean, it's good if the big companies that were lumbering along for a long time, if they can adapt, fantastic. If startups out there can think about these things we're talking about, and obviously I'm haven't come up with every solution myself, or else I would probably be out there pursuing it right now. I think that's the way to do it, is you try and find your opportunity, and then the future will be exciting. I think that's, where a small company or someone with entrepreneurial instincts can move.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a lot I can add on that, but I do think in this region, there are two glaring opportunities that we would both share in excitement around, and that's the U.S. free trade agreements that exist with Oman and Jordan that are criminally underutilized by the startup community. So if there is value additive manufacturing or anything that overlaps, that could be, marginally better, cheaper, faster, and it can be done from those countries. You could have a huge market, duty-free entry through the free trade agreements in both Oman and Jordan. And I have never seen a single pitch from a startup. Obviously, there's lots of established businesses that are taking advantage of it. And there's a lot of US businesses that do manufacturing in these countries, obviously. But very rarely do I see bright, energetic entrepreneurs looking at those sorts of opportunities. And I think the other thing to take into account is, and I saw the question earlier from the poll, we don't think we're going to be back in offices. A third said at the end of this year, a third said next summer. So let's split the difference and say it started next year. If you're starting a business from scratch right now, or you're at that point where you've got your concept and you've got your product, but you don't know who to go to, the trust factor is so crucial right now in all economies. Trust is a big deal right now, and you can see it's eroding between people and governments and things like that. But between consumers and businesses, trust is so big. And so really, if you've got a handful of ways you can go to market, I would always double down, especially in this instance, with trust. The people, the network you have, the relationships you can lean on and call those favors in, people who are going to trust you. Maybe you worked with them in a previous business. Maybe you worked with them on a previous research project. I think that's going to have a ton of value in kind of this new normal. Along these same lines, who's the most, or which sectors do you see right now as kind of the most impacted sectors? We've moved kind of macro, government, regional. Now we're kind of in just sectors, which could be, multi-regional. Which are the sectors that are just the most hard hit? And then as an easy follow-up, what sectors do you think are going to be the quickest to kind of bounce back and recover? We're already seeing energies prices have rebounded to some degree after the whole storage issue. But what is that direct impact industry? We've talked tourism, we've talked energy, and then which one do you think is going to recover the fastest?
Well, I mean, so it's unfortunate too. I mean, for either big companies or startup companies, I mean, you see from startup fund flows, startup company fund flows, and then large companies as well. Travel has been decimated. Public transportation, airlines. I mean, anything that has any relation to people being in close contact in a transportation environment has been, really, really hit hard. Entertainment, we said, the tourism destinations obviously are not doing well and having a severe consequence for them. To a large extent, I'm even thinking in the real estate sector, what the dynamics there, although I think it's uncertain now, what does it even mean to have valuable real estate? I mean, it used to be, and I wanted to be, I'm just thinking here, it used to be that I would always want to be on the top floor, and that was the most expensive apartment, the most expensive office. Now I got to wait a long time to be in an elevator with less than 3 people. How long will that last? I mean, how long will that sector go through a transformation where real estate, who knows? I mean, in the city, are people going to want to be going to suburbs? Are they going to want to be in urbanization? I think as far as impact and uncertainty on the whole real estate environment,
right?
Confident transportation, entertainment, leisure, everything we talked about urbanization is having a problem. So I think if you look at a city, look at everything about a city that made it a good place to be, has a problem. On the flip side, the stuff that's doing well, as we talked about, software, ICT, digital solutions, that's doing it. Education, ed tech. Ed tech is very interesting. I don't know how long people want to go online and do their education, but it's certainly there. Healthcare, it's a whole new world. And everybody, that's one area that's raged in success, biotech, and maybe it'll flame out over time, it'll normalize again, but people, as I said, health has become very important. Education is very important to people. The ability to get on with your life kind of areas, which may or may not have a persistence in the way we've had to move into, the new tools that we use. Those are things that are hot. But I think trying to get back into the areas that we need to protect. I mean, I'm one that believes it's not a good idea to get rid of public transportation. It's not a good idea for the airlines to be, insolvent, because we need to eventually travel. Not everything's going to be web conference and video conference.
Right.
So those, I mean, for those interested, I mean, I do a lot of work, and I've published a paper recently on the whole transportation sector and the impact of COVID. And I do think that we need to try to find ways to certainly leverage this opportunity to move more toward environmentally friendly transportation. Electric vehicles, whether it's, battery, electric, or it's, moving to, again, electric is, again, it's hydrogen, but it's a different fuel source. Moving, I think walking and cycling, which has been, now it's all the rage, places where you can do it. Nobody want to be around other people, so they're walking and cycling, building new infrastructure for that. It's great, but then we also have to try to make sure that we're still for those people that need it, buses and trains and trams and all those kind of things. So I think, there's that. If I were, I am somewhat of an entrepreneur, I think a lot about transportation and where that's headed. I think that is a place that's been disrupted in some regards. Some parts of it have been catalyzed as far as activity and sustainable ways of doing soft transportation. But I think that's a good place for an entrepreneur to be engaged. I mean, it's we look at the financial crisis of 2009 or 2000 was the period of 2008, 2009.
Yep.
What emerged out of that was a sharing economy. People, you had all people, they were financially distressed, there was unused assets, people needed work. The gig economy, the shared economy, ride hailing, it emerged. Even the outside of transportation itself, which is ride hailing, extremely disruptive. The sharing of apartments, Airbnb emerged, startup company formed out of the crisis, these kind of opportunities where there is a new norm, a new way in which people think about the world. If you could find what's persistent, I think you find the things that are going to make you successful as an entrepreneur. And that's what's exciting now. I mean, it's a terrible crisis for startups and such, but if you can hit on the thing that's going to stick and it's not there already, and you can disrupt some big businesses, I think it's a good way for the world to evolve into hopefully a more sustainable mode of operation. We don't want to disrupt those that are doing a good job, but it's an opportunity.
Absolutely. I think one of the key things that entrepreneurs tend to overlook, and obviously if you're sitting in a software startup that focuses on transportation, massive market, you've got all the benefits of not having a lot of CapEx, great, go forward and conquer. But you're integrating with huge cities and probably large enterprise and fleets, and your integration time is going to take years. So that's the downside there. But on the other side, if you do the more capital intensive focus, to your point, and you maybe say, we want to look at something that's electric or more green, how can we go in and get these fleets going green perhaps, and getting these larger customers more plugged in? What do you think the impact of a lot of the monetary policy is going to have on some of those more ambitious ideas? Because if you look at what Airbnb and Uber did, is it made everybody a landlord. It gave everybody the opportunity to kind of say, hey, I want in on this passive income. I've invested here. I took nice photos. I did my furniture a certain way. I've got that Gustav Klimt everybody has on the wall, put it on the market. What does that look like in a low interest rate world? I mean, everybody's going to have access to assets. Everybody's going to have the ability to kind of go down to a banker, and if they have okay credit and a job, they can go purchase this or that. So what are some of the, the same way we talked about the value additive aspects of maybe manufacturing and other areas, what are some of those kind of value additive ways that you can look at transport, and you can look at more CapEx intensive investments that maybe governments and businesses could look at? I mentioned fleets, but I'm sure there's others.
Well, I'll give you, so I'll put a plug in for my own work. So
yeah, please.
I think when you're a business, let's just say that not every idea that's going to come out, it's going to be a new startup that's successful, is going to be something wholly new to the world of innovation, right? Or be a wholly new innovation. Where I see opportunity, and I have a paper with a colleague of mine at Benjamin Sovacool at Sussex University. We were looking at low carbon innovations and the cultural aspects of either having those succeed or fail. And I believe as an entrepreneur, you've got to remember that every market is a market, right? Very few people create a company that serves the entire world successfully. So if I'm looking at any of these transportation opportunities, or maybe it's Airbnb, your housing, you go, if you know deeply, and you're from, let's say I'm from Egypt, let's say from a few areas, if I know my environment locally very well, and there is a market which is sizable, and there are people willing to pay for a service, and I know the cultural context, yep. I know what makes people interested in doing certain things, and I cater to those people, I have a market opportunity, which is my market opportunity. And so, this nature sustainability paper that we've recently published is about a paradigm where to be successful in low carbon innovation, you need to understand what the people around you really need and what they want. What are their cultural norms? What are their cultural practices? What are their values? I took, one of the studies I looked at was Korean. We had Uber. Uber seems like it could go into every market and do the same thing. It could. Yeah. But then you start to look at all of the ride-hailing companies, which are in separate geographic markets because they have a slightly different tailoring to cultural context. I think if you can take your idea for, if it's a capital intensive with all the stimulus floating around,
yep.
You want to do something disruptive, and you know that now there may be shifts in practices, there may be shifts in norms, you have an opportunity to take this concept, this paradigm of understanding culture as barrier or catalyst, and apply it to ideas which maybe they're not wholly new, but they're wholly new in a new environment.
True.
That to me, and so is the risk high? Not if you really know what you're talking about in your market. If you come in and you're an American entrepreneur and you've had a disruptive technology deployed in LA, right. You're going to go do it in Cairo, it may not work. It's a little different. So I'd say for an entrepreneurial perspective, what I've been thinking about for my own self is, if I would like to do something disruptive, I need my technology, but I gotta be a social scientist too. I gotta know what makes the people tick. Everybody wants to conquer the world, but you got to start somewhere. I think if you really take that to heart and you tailor your technology toward the local context, you've got a winner. And that's so often forgotten. Believe it or not, we get the paper published in Nature, and you would think people would know this is just a common paradigm, but it really is a kind of new thinking. I mean, it's not that, once it's like all these things in hindsight, it makes a perfect sense. It's obvious, but
Sure.
it's not much talked about. It's really not. And so I think that's a good opportunity as the stimulus packages roll out.
But isn't it called globalization? There's a McDonald's item that's local to each market. So, I think they're trying. I'm kidding. So one of the big things I think coming out of this crisis, that anybody that's building, anybody that's making decisions, this could be a parent, it could be a manager, it could be someone starting their career. You've got to go where demand is, and you've got to generate demand in order to be successful, I think. And there's one industry that time and time again has kind of landed on its feet no matter what the market looks like. And we have a question around it from Nazar. It's about education. Education is, seemingly resilient, but he kind of gives a pretty interesting scenario here that I think is worth unpacking. How quick will schools/education systems adapt to digitization? Considering the impact of investment is usually made, health risk factor going back to normal, and not only how quick, but do you see a domino effect if digitization is adopted? Is it something where, to your point about the real estate investment, maybe do schools need to have these huge structures anymore? If the value of the degree is XYZ, do I have to go there? Do I have to go somewhere else? What's your take?
Well, again, this is one of my thoughts. As I said, what is going to be dynamic and then sort of go back to the old norm, or it could be persistent change.
Right.
In education, all of a sudden, everybody's doing online, right? So Khalifa University, we bumbled around for a bit, and now it's really nice. And the guys did a great job. Things are online. Everything, I think, is pretty good. But and it wasn't really that long of a period where things were a little bit unclear about how to do it. But it was because there was an urgency, we did it. And everyone's, globally, there's very few places that have not moved online in some way. It's been a great business for the online educational software provider. Now, I don't believe education can be done fully online. I've done BSc, MBA, PhD, minors, and I've done a lot of it. I now work in education institutions. So I realized being around people and interacting with colleagues and having, especially business school, right? That's the whole point, is to be around people. So you basically need to have some level of engagement. But I believe, as I said before, and you asked me on the opportunities,
Yep.
If I were to go into this market today, I would see it as being a persistent share of education being online. I don't think it's everything online. I don't think you can't quantify it that way, but just like people would now work out in home. I mean, some will stay there for some part of the week and some will go back to the gym when they're allowed to. So it's a shift that you can take advantage of, which I believe will be an opportunity. In education, it's happened, and it's still maybe not as streamlined as it needs to be. So if you've got a novel idea, a great idea to how to do some part of advanced education, higher education, or K-12 or whatever in a better way online, I think it's an opportunity, because there will be some part of this, which is, for whatever reason, a persistent opportunity to bring education more toward, maybe it's people that were disadvantaged in education to begin with. Maybe the market won't be New York City and Boston, Massachusetts. Maybe it'll be developing Africa. We said that's where all the growth is happening.
Right.
Online to the villages is going to be once they got digital access in a more robust way and they got higher speed connection. That's the exploration to happen. Is my message would be, take the paradigm shifts that happen now, or what we think could be paradigm shift. Go back to the mega trend, right? So you've got people getting older. You've got people going, we hope they're still going to go to cities. They're growing up in a large population growth in Africa, Southeast Asia, right? In a world that's getting more impacted by climate change. Clean energy, clean approach to life in a distributed digital way in the right geographic context is a business opportunity. right? And so education is great because, as I said, that's part of happiness, being educated, being able to hold a good job. So I think the move won't be 100% the way we've seen it now, but it is a long-term opportunity that you need to find the right context to optimally position.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I go in waves of flirting with the idea of going back to school or doing education or and I turned 40 this year. My wife's like, just do an executive course here or there. And for me, I think if I were to do it, I think the whole dream of doing it, the fantasy is I would go full time. It's what I do. I would focus on it. It's all I do. What a luxury, something I've never really done even in college. I worked, 2 or 3 jobs. So it's definitely something that is shifting. I don't know if you saw President Trump passed the skills bill or he did an executive order. I'm not sure which it was, but it basically is pushing for.
Probably an executive order if it's from President Trump.
Probably. Yeah, he does like to shoot from the hip. But it is definitely focused on skills first. So, and I don't know if it's for all jobs, but I know there's a lot of companies that already were getting rid of college education being a requirement. You famously see Google and Facebook and these. So, I think, to direct the question, I think there's considerable opportunity, and I think there will be an absolute domino effect. But I think you're going to see something like the watering down of, Craigslist. Do you remember that old grid in 07, 08? And they said, Craigslist. And it's all these different marketplaces on Craigslist, and like 13 or 14 and now 40 different startups basically sprung up and kind of ate away off the back of those listings. And that was a long time of growth hack, is you would go for one vertical on Craigslist and just eat away at it. Just build a scraper and start grabbing those listings, or you'd call them and then cross-post the listing, whatever it was, or the item. But it's not that simple in education. And there's a lot of multi-generational relationships and expectation and tiebacks in education. So I don't know if it's something where you can go in and say, like, we're going to grab the gifted students and they're going to go here, or we're going to grab, the ESL students and they're going to go to this type of program. I don't know if it's going to be like that. But to make a parallel, and I think we can wrap up on this, an industry that this is happening around is healthcare. And we're talking about the unbundling of the hospitals and the healthcare networks and things like that. Where do you see, kind of, just to summarize everything we've gone through, the next kind of year or two, and some of the cool trends in healthcare that are unbundling in a way that may not be as parallel to education? It could be specific healthcare plans. It could be, community health, some of these other initiatives. What are you seeing to kind of get through the next 6 to 12 months of COVID-19?
Well, as I'm glad you brought it up, I think telemedicine is going to be something for a long time. So it is very convenient now to engage with a doctor, in a remote sense. It's much quicker. It's sometimes much easier for the doctor-patient relationship to develop. And actually, with tech coming available now, wearables and such, getting fairly decent sense of your vitals, your bio signals available to the doctor is becoming increasingly available. So I think that ability to leverage technology, whether it's connecting to your doctor remotely or getting your vitals measured and your health state available to the doctor, that's all going to be continuing on. I think that's going to evolve and become stronger over time. I think regulation in healthcare, I hope, it becomes stronger in the sense some cases may be eased. I mean, we may see new competitors that are moving in the space because all the different dynamic needs that came out of the COVID and the ability to have to ramp up, especially the vaccine manufacture, the way clinical trials are being done. I think it's great. I mean, now we can maybe get drugs out in critical areas much quicker if we can continue forward with some of the practices that have been adopted, if they work out well. I think that, it's a very good opportunity. I think patient care can ultimately be improved by some of the areas which we're having robotic technologies interact with people now. Robotic surgery was already moving forward, and company way back, Intuitive Surgical, I saw these guys way back, and I was very impressed with them, I think 10 years ago or more than 10 years ago. Was that Da Vinci? Yeah, the Da Vinci system. Yeah. I think, med tech, I mean, it's great. In the operating room, now with people worried about infection, but it's an augmentation of human skill in an area where we care about deeply. It's our own health. And so I think the surge, the continued upswing in med tech is going to be something that's going to be very powerful and useful. And I think finally just going digital on health records, being able to understand patient histories, that did not happen fast enough. I mean, that was out there forever. Now we know we need it. It would be nice if we had it today as robust as we could use it. But I think that the learning from this is that health needs to transform. I mean, we need to do it better. It's unfortunate that a global pandemic got some of these things moving. But as I said,
Crazy.
Things that were happening maybe 10 years out or maybe longer, now they're before us today. And I hope they're persistent and they can offer some good benefits in the future.
I'm definitely agree with you. It's interesting to see that urgent care is kind of becoming the primary focus, and non-urgent care is something that they say, well, maybe we can wait. Maybe we can try some of these other things. Have you heard of precision medicine? It's like, well, absolutely. What medicine isn't precise? But all of a sudden now the conversation, you hear nurses, you hear everybody's bought into precision medicine. Well, what do you need in order to get there? You need the data, you need institutional buy-in, you need interoperability between urgent and non-urgent care and everything else, chronic care. So yeah, it's really interesting that it's all kind of coming to a head. And I think if to use them head to head, and they're two large regulated industries, but I think education has a longer road to hoe than healthcare. I think the inertia.
I agree. No, I'm with you on that. I think education is a good opportunity, but I think healthcare is one area. We said at the beginning, that is now a hot topic. It's front of mind. It's one of the new normals. Yep. Healthcare. So let's take advantage of it.
Well said. Well, we've spent an hour together. We've answered some questions. I don't really have anything else for you, Steve. This has been great. I've learned a lot. I hope everybody who's been watching at home has learned a lot. And I really thank you for your time, and I thank you for everything you do for the Enterprise Forum. And if anybody hasn't read it yet, please check out his article. And I'm sure it's online or being sent out through the invite. I thought it was great, and it's a great kind of context to everything we discussed today. So thanks again.
Thank you, Will, and thanks to Enterprise Forum for inviting me. I really enjoyed today, and hope we can do it again sometime.
Sounds great.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.